There's one mental principle that separates the people who dream from the people who do. One mindset shift that takes you from waiting for life to change to becoming the force that changes everything. Most people don't lose because they're not talented or smart or capable. They lose because they've handed over control of their mind to excuses, fear, and circumstance. But the moment you take absolute ownership of your thoughts, your emotions, your decisions, that's the moment you step into a league where almost no one else is playing. When I talk about absolute mental ownership, I'm talking about the moment you stop waiting for someone to save you, validate you, approve you, fix you, or push you. It's the moment you finally realize nobody is coming, and that's the most liberating moment of your life. Because when you understand that your results, your emotions, your habits, your reactions, your success, your failures, all of it come back to you, suddenly you reclaim a level of power that most people never touch. Most people spend their entire lives giving away their power without even noticing it. They blame their past, their parents, their job, the economy, their environment, their circumstances, their doubts. They hand out pieces of their identity to everything around them and then wonder why they feel lost, stuck, or behind. The truth is, you cannot rise while your excuses are holding the steering wheel. You cannot evolve while your mind is chained to stories that convince you you're not ready, not enough, or not capable. But something shifts the moment you say, I own this. All of it. And I don't mean it in a harsh way, I mean it in an empowering way. Because when you own something internally, you also gain the authority to change it. Most people think responsibility means blame. It doesn't. Responsibility means power. If you take responsibility for your mindset, you take responsibility for your potential. If you take responsibility for your habits, you take responsibility for your trajectory. You stop sitting in the passenger seat of your own life and finally take the wheel. That's the point where the game changes. It begins in the smallest moments. The moment you decide how you're going to interpret failure. The moment you decide how you're going to show up when you don't feel like it. The moment you decide what you're going to focus on when everything around you feels overwhelming. Every breakthrough is built on a pattern of these micro choices. People think breakthroughs happen in a single moment, but they actually happen in the thousands of moments before it. The ones you think don't matter, the ones nobody sees. Absolute mental ownership means you become the architect of those moments. You stop acting like life is happening to you and start acting like life is happening through you. And here's where everything starts to expand. When you take ownership of your thoughts, you naturally start taking ownership of your emotions. You stop letting the world dictate how you feel. You stop letting circumstances control your energy. You stop living in reaction. Instead, you decide what state you're going to live in, regardless of what's happening around you. You learn to shift out of fear faster. You learn to shift out of doubt faster. You learn to shift into clarity, strength, and certainty, even when nothing feels certain. That's what makes you unstoppable. You know what most people never understand? That their inner world is creating their outer world. They keep trying to change external things, jobs, relationships, environments, without ever upgrading the internal operating system that's producing the results. But when you take full ownership of your mind, the external world eventually has no choice but to follow. The world bends to the person who refuses to let their circumstances define them. That's how leaders are made. That's how peak performers rise. Not because they're lucky, gifted, or chosen, but because they chose to own their mind while everyone else continued to outsource it. This principle puts you ahead of almost everyone because so few people ever truly embrace it. Most people would rather hold on to the comfort of their excuses than the discomfort of growth. They would rather stay the same than confront the parts of themselves that need to evolve. But when you're willing to take responsibility for the stories you tell yourself, the energy you bring, the actions you take, and the identity you reinforce every single day, you become untouchable. That's when discipline becomes automatic. That's when confidence becomes natural. That's when momentum becomes inevitable, because you're not negotiating with your mind anymore, you're leading it. You become the kind of person who doesn't wait for permission to rise. You create the standard, you create the momentum, you create the life. And people look at you and think, how are they advancing so fast? How do they keep winning? How do they keep elevating? It's not magic, it's not luck, it's ownership. Full, unapologetic, radical ownership. And when you take that step, everything else in your life begins to shift with it. Your habits, your courage, your decisions, your identity, your future. This is the point where most people fall behind and the point where leaders rise ahead. You just have to decide to own it, all of it, every day, every moment. Because that's the principle that puts you ahead of everyone. Most people go through life in a constant state of reaction. They wake up reacting to the alarm, reacting to problems, reacting to people's expectations, reacting to stress, reacting to fear, reacting to whatever life throws at them. They're always one step behind, always trying to catch up, always feeling like life is happening too fast. And the reason they stay stuck is simple. You cannot create an extraordinary life while living in a reactive state. Creation and reaction cannot coexist. One pulls you forward, the other pulls you backward. One builds your future, the other traps you in your past. And when you finally understand that, something shifts inside you. You start to realize that the people who rise, the people who lead, the people who win aren't the ones who react the fastest, they're the ones who create the fastest. Creation is where your power lives. Creation is where your identity transforms. Creation is where your future begins. When you become a creator rather than a reactor, you stop waiting for the perfect moment because you understand that times you times create the moment. You stop waiting for opportunities because you understand that times you times generate opportunities. You stop waiting for conditions to be right because you understand that times you times create the conditions. That's the difference between people who live life and people who shape life. But here's the truth, most people never learn. Shifting from reaction to creation doesn't start with your actions, it starts with your state. Your emotional state determines everything. When you're stressed, overwhelmed, anxious, or exhausted, your brain moves into survival mode. In that state, you react, you retreat, you collapse inward, you cling to safety, you avoid risk, you protect your comfort zone. But when you shift into a state of clarity, certainty, energy, and purpose, something completely different happens. Instead of reacting to the world, you begin directing the world. You start making decisions from strength, not fear. You start seeing solutions instead of problems. You start anticipating instead of hesitating. And just like that, you move from being someone life controls to someone who controls life. This is why mastering your state is non-negotiable. When you control your state, you control your choices. When you control your choices, you control your actions. And when you control your actions, you create your outcomes. That's the chain reaction of achievement. Not one big moment, not one dramatic breakthrough, just a consistent shift from reaction to creation over and over again. People ask, how do I start creating instead of reacting? And the answer is simpler than you think. You start by interrupting the pattern that pulls you back into doubt, the pattern that pulls you back into fear, the pattern that pulls you back into hesitation and procrastination. You interrupt the pattern by asking better questions. Instead of, why is this happening to me? You ask, what can I make happen right now? Instead of, what if I fail? You ask, what can I learn? Instead of, I hope things get better. You ask, how can I make things better today? These questions shift your focus, and wherever your focus goes, your energy follows. When your energy shifts, your identity shifts. You stop seeing yourself as someone who reacts to life circumstances and start seeing yourself as someone who designs life's direction. And here's what's interesting. When you step into the mindset of a creator, people around you feel the shift. They start responding to you differently. Opportunities start aligning differently. Challenges start shrinking because you're no longer facing them from a state of fear, you're facing them from a state of power. And when you face life with power, life responds to that power. You begin moving differently, talking differently, thinking differently. You wake up with intention instead of anxiety. You approach problems with strategy instead of stress. You step into rooms with certainty instead of hesitation. You stop waiting for life to calm down because you're no longer controlled by the chaos. You're driven by your purpose. That's what creation feels like. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's intentional. It's directed. It's powerful. And you want to know something? Once you experience creation, reaction becomes unbearable. You can feel when you're slipping back into it. You can feel when you're letting life pull you instead of leading it. And in that moment, you correct yourself. You adjust your state. You elevate your focus. You bring your mind back to the truth. You are not here to react to the world. You're here to influence it. Because when you stop reacting and start creating, you stop living the life you were given and start living the life you were meant for. If there's one thing people underestimate more than anything else, it's the role their emotions play in every outcome of their life. We're taught to focus on strategy, on planning, on goals, on discipline, and all of that matters. But none of it works if you're in the wrong emotional state. You could have the perfect plan, the perfect opportunity, the perfect intention, but if you're operating from fear, doubt, frustration, or hesitation, you won't execute. Emotion drives behavior. Emotion drives decision-making. Emotion drives momentum. And until you master your emotional state, you will always feel like you're fighting an uphill battle. Most people live in emotional autopilot. They wake up and immediately fall into whatever emotion the day hands them. Maybe it's stress, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's pressure, maybe it's frustration about something that happened yesterday. And once they lock into that emotional state, the rest of the day follows that pattern. They make reactive decisions. They avoid challenges. They talk themselves out of opportunities. They lower their standards without even realizing it. They allow the emotion of the moment to dictate the quality of their future. But the moment you shift your emotional state, everything else shifts with it. Your thoughts elevate. Your options expand. Your creativity unlocks. Your courage activates. Your focus sharpens. That's why emotional mastery isn't optional, it's foundational. Your emotional state is the lens through which you interpret your world. When you're in a strong, empowered state, the same challenge that once felt overwhelming now feels like an opportunity. The same setback that used to discourage you now becomes fuel. The same criticism that once stung now becomes irrelevant. This is why two people can face the exact same situation and have completely different outcomes, because one is led by their emotions, while the other has learned to lead their emotions. And here's the truth. Your emotions are not random. They are not uncontrollable. They are not something that just happened to you. Your emotions are a result of three things: what you focus on, the meaning you assign to situations, and the physical state of your body. Change any one of those three and you change your emotions. Change all three and you change your life. This is why high performers don't leave their emotional state to chance. They create rituals. They create patterns. They create practices that prime their body and mind to operate from strength instead of survival, because they know that the state they enter the day with is the state that determines what the day becomes. Think about the moments in your life where you performed at your best moments, where you felt fully alive, confident, capable, unstoppable. Those moments weren't accidents. They were a reflection of the emotional state you were in. Now imagine if you could access that state not once in a blue moon, not only when things are going well, but every single day. Imagine making decisions from that place. Imagine building habits from that place. Imagine facing challenges from that place. Everything changes. And people often say, but how do I stay in a powerful state when life gets difficult? You don't wait for life to get easier. You train yourself to get stronger. Emotional mastery is not about avoiding negative emotions. It's about not letting them take the driver's seat. You can feel fear and still take action. You can feel uncertainty and still move forward. You can feel discomfort and still rise. The difference between people who succeed and people who stay stuck is not that successful people feel less emotion. They've just learned how to lead themselves through those emotions instead of collapsing under them. Emotion is energy. And when you understand how to redirect that energy, every limitation becomes leverage. Every fear becomes information. Every challenge becomes a stepping stone. This is the advantage people feel but never fully understand. They think some people are just naturally confident or naturally disciplined or naturally courageous. They're not. They've just conditioned their emotional state so consistently that it becomes their default setting. And this is where personal transformation becomes real. Because once you master your emotional state, you no longer wait for motivation, you create it. You no longer wait for confidence, you generate it. You no longer wait for momentum, you become the source of momentum. You stop being pulled by your emotions and start being powered by them. That's when discipline stops feeling heavy and starts feeling natural. That's when challenges stop breaking you and start building you. That's when your life begins to align with the future you want instead of the patterns you've been repeating. And when you reach that point, you're no longer trying to force success, you're embodying it. Because emotional mastery isn't just a skill, it's the foundation of every breakthrough you will ever have. It's the switch that turns intention into action, action into momentum, and momentum into results. That's why emotional mastery drives results. Identity is one of the most powerful forces in the human experience, yet most people never intentionally shape it. They go through life thinking their identity is something fixed, something formed by their past, their environment, their upbringing, or the limitations people placed on them. But identity isn't permanent. It's not a label. You weren't born with a sticker on your forehead saying who you're allowed to become. Identity is a choice. Identity is a decision. Identity is a pattern reinforced by what you repeatedly believe about yourself. And the moment you realize that, the moment you understand that who you become is determined not by who you were, but by who you decide to be next, everything in your life begins to transform. Most people live in patterns because they live in the identity of their past. They define themselves by what went wrong, by who hurt them, by the mistakes they made, by the failures they experienced, or even by the results they never reached. They lock themselves into old stories without realizing those stories were written by a version of them that no longer exists. The problem isn't that they failed, it's that they built an identity around the failure. The problem isn't that they struggled, it's that they adopted the identity of someone who always struggles. The moment you identify with limitation, you begin living within its walls. Your identity becomes a cage disguised as a personality. But when you shift your identity, even slightly, your entire trajectory shifts with it, because identity determines destiny. Your beliefs shape your behavior shapes your habits shape your results, and your results reinforce your identity all over again. So the question isn't, what do I want? The real question is, who do I need to become for what I want to be inevitable? When you focus on becoming, the having takes care of itself. People think change begins with action, but real change begins with identity. If you see yourself as someone who's inconsistent, you will behave inconsistently no matter how strong your goals are. If you see yourself as someone who always quits, your mind will find reasons to quit even when you want to continue. But if you decide you're someone who follows through, who shows up, who keeps pushing, who holds a higher standard, you begin acting in alignment with that identity long before the results show up. Identity is the thermostat of your life. You can get bursts of motivation, but if your identity doesn't match your goals, your results will always return to the identity you believe is you. This is why you see people win for a moment and then sabotage themselves. They get momentum, they get an opportunity, they make progress, and then they do something that pulls them right back down. Not because they're weak, not because they lack discipline, but because the success they created didn't match the identity they were living with. Their achievements grew, but their identity stayed the same. And when the identity and the outcome don't match, the identity always wins. Always. So how do you change it? You start by breaking the story. The story that says you're not ready. The story that says you're not enough. The story that says people like you don't succeed. The story that says your past defines you. Those stories are not facts, they're habits. Emotional habits, mental habits, identity habits. And habits can be rewritten the moment you decide you're no longer living under someone else's script. You begin reinforcing a new identity with actions, decisions, and standards that match where you want to go, not where you've been. You stop asking, can I do this? And instead ask, who would I be if I fully stepped into the future I want? Because identity isn't only built by thinking differently, it's built by behaving differently. You walk like the person you're becoming. You talk like the person you're becoming. You make decisions like the person you're becoming. You show up with the energy, the presence, the certainty of the person you're becoming. You stop negotiating with the version of you that's trying to stay small because you understand that version isn't going where you're going. And something incredible happens when you start living from your future identity instead of your past. One, the decisions that once felt difficult now feel natural. The habits that once felt heavy now feel aligned. The actions that once felt intimidating now feel inevitable. You're not forcing discipline, you're acting in character. You're not searching for confidence, you're speaking from identity. You're not trying to be someone, you're returning to who you are always capable of becoming. When your identity shifts, your emotions follow. Your energy follows, your standards follow. You stop settling for what life gives you and start demanding what you know you're meant for. You stop shrinking yourself to make others comfortable and start expanding into who you were built to be. That's when life begins responding to you differently because you're no longer walking into your future as the same person who lived in your past. And you want to know the most empowering part? You don't need permission to rewrite your identity. You don't need validation. You don't need the world to agree with your new direction. You only need one moment, one decision to say, this is who I am now. And once you claim that identity, once you reinforce it with consistent action, once you stop returning to older versions of yourself just because they're familiar, you begin creating a destiny that feels aligned, powerful, and unstoppable. Your identity is the foundation of everything in your life. Change your identity, and everything else follows. That's why identity determines destiny. Discipline becomes a completely different experience the moment you internalize absolute ownership. Most people think discipline is this external force you have to fight with every single day, an exhausting battle between what you want now and what you want most. They treat discipline like a punishment, like something they have to drag themselves through, like a burden they carry only on the days when motivation disappears. And because of that, they're constantly in conflict with themselves. They wake up negotiating. They negotiate with their goals. They negotiate with their excuses. They negotiate with the old identity they're supposed to be outgrowing. It's a tug of war they never stop playing. But when you adopt the mindset of complete internal ownership, the negotiation ends. Discipline stops being this heavy external force you have to push into place. It becomes a natural extension of who you are. You don't discipline yourself because you're supposed to. You discipline yourself because it's aligned with your identity. It matches your standards. It reflects the person you decided to become. Once ownership is internal, discipline stops feeling like restriction and starts feeling like freedom. You're not forcing yourself anymore. You're reinforcing yourself. And here's what most people never understand. Every action you take, every decision you make, every habit you repeat is a vote for your identity. If you haven't fully taken ownership of your identity, discipline is always going to feel like a battle. You'll feel like you're trying to become someone you're not. But when your identity is shifted, discipline feels like maintenance, not sacrifice. You're simply maintaining the standard that matches the future you've claimed for yourself. Think about it. When you see yourself as someone who follows through, showing up isn't difficult, it's expected. When you see yourself as someone who values growth, taking action isn't overwhelming, it's automatic. When you see yourself as someone who refuses to settle, discipline isn't a chore, it's the natural expression of your standards. You start to realize that discipline isn't about pushing yourself harder, it's about aligning with the person you already decided to become. When ownership becomes a part of you, you don't wait for motivation anymore, you don't wait for the right timing, you don't wait for the perfect conditions. You become the condition, you create the momentum, you build the environment. Discipline loses its weight because your mind stops arguing about whether you should do something. The conversation disappears. There's no more bargaining, no more maybe later, no more I don't feel like it. You don't need to feel like it, you are it. And that's the shift most people never reach. People think discipline is about willpower, but willpower is weak. It fluctuates, it drains, it fails. Identity doesn't, ownership doesn't. When your identity is strong enough, discipline is the byproduct. It's not something you try to force, it's something that flows naturally from the standards you've set. Your actions rise to meet your identity. Your habits rise to match your decisions. Your behavior rises to match your internal commitments. And because of that, you stop abandoning yourself at the first sign of discomfort. That's the real turning point. Because one of the reasons people struggle with discipline is that they attach too much meaning to discomfort. They think uncomfortable means stop. They think resistance means something is wrong. They think fear means they aren't ready. But when you fully internalized ownership, you stop interpreting discomfort as a signal to retreat. You interpret it as evidence that you're growing, evidence that you're stretching into a new level, evidence that you're operating in alignment with your future, not your past. Discipline becomes a practice of honoring yourself, not punishing yourself. You start treating your commitments as promises. You start treating your goals as obligations to your future identity, not as wishes. You start seeing obstacles not as reasons to quit, but as opportunities to reinforce your identity. Every challenge becomes another moment where you prove to yourself who you are. And the more you prove it, the stronger your identity becomes. And the stronger your identity becomes, the easier discipline gets. It becomes second nature, a reflex, a rhythm. You become the type of person who doesn't need to be reminded, pushed, motivated, or corrected. You lead yourself, you drive yourself, you set the standard and hold the standard. And what's even more powerful is that people around you start to feel that energy too. They see your consistency, they see your commitment, they see this internal alignment that most people don't have, and it influences them. It sets the tone. It creates an atmosphere of certainty. Your discipline becomes a representation of your identity, steady, unshakable, and aligned. And that's when life begins opening doors for you that were never available before. Because life always rewards the person who leads themselves without negotiation. Life always expands for the person who stands firmly in their standards. Life always elevates the person who refuses to outsource responsibility for who they are becoming. Discipline becomes effortless when it reflects who you truly are. There's a moment in every person's life when they realize they've been running not from danger, not from failure, not from the world, but from responsibility. And responsibility isn't a burden. It isn't something meant to weigh you down or make life harder. Responsibility is the doorway to freedom. It's the gateway to growth. It's the signal that says you're finally ready to stop living small and start stepping into the life you're meant to create. But most people never walk through that doorway because responsibility requires you to face something far more uncomfortable than fear. It requires you to face yourself. We grow up in a society that trains us to avoid responsibility because responsibility exposes us. If something goes wrong, we have to look at our actions. If we fall short, we can't blame circumstances. If our life isn't where we want it to be, we can't hide behind excuses. And that level of honesty scares people. So instead they run, they distract themselves, they soften their standards, they wrap themselves in stories that let them avoid discomfort. They tell themselves they'll start later when things calm down or when they feel ready. But ready never comes. Someday never arrives. And the life they want slips further and further out of reach. But something changes instantaneously when you stop running. When you decide you're done outsourcing your future to luck, timing, or circumstance. When you choose responsibility, not as a chore, but as a declaration of power. Suddenly, the things that used to intimidate you become manageable. The obstacles that once felt overwhelming turn into challenges you're willing to face. The excuses that once controlled your thinking lose their grip, because responsibility is not about taking blame for everything. It's about taking control of what's next. And here's what people don't realize. Responsibility is not heavy when you stop fighting it. Responsibility becomes heavy only when you resist it. When you accept it fully, it becomes fuel. It becomes clarity. It becomes certainty. It becomes momentum. Your entire world expands because you stop being the person life happens to and become the person life responds to. The moment you accept responsibility for your emotions, you stop letting stress, fear, or insecurity dictate your behavior. The moment you accept responsibility for your habits, you stop waiting for motivation to show up. The moment you accept responsibility for your decisions, you stop blaming life for outcomes you never took ownership of. And the moment you accept responsibility for your potential, you stop settling for a version of yourself you know is beneath what you're capable of becoming. Responsibility isn't a weight, it's a doorway. And once you step through it, you meet a stronger, more grounded, more capable version of yourself on the other side. But here's the truth few people speak about. Responsibility requires courage, real courage. Not the kind you post about, not the kind you talk about when everything is going well, but the courage to look at the parts of your life that aren't working and admit you're the one with the power to change them. Responsibility asks you to confront your patterns, your distractions, your limitations, your emotional defaults, your old identity. It asks you to rise above your excuses and choose a higher standard even when it's inconvenient. And that level of honesty, if you truly embrace it, becomes the most liberating experience of your life. Because responsibility is not pressure, it's permission. It's the permission to grow, the permission to evolve, the permission to rewrite the story you've been living in, the permission to stop playing small, and the permission to step into the identity you've been avoiding but desperately craving. When you stop running from responsibility, your future begins to accelerate. You make decisions faster, you take action sooner, you trust yourself more deeply, you stop second-guessing everything, you stop waiting for perfect conditions, you stop shrinking to protect your comfort zone, you stop handing your power to circumstances you should be leading, and you begin to operate with a level of certainty that other people can feel. The moment you walk into a room, life rewards the person who takes responsibility. Not because life is fair, not because life follows rules, but because life mirrors your internal state. If you lead yourself, you create momentum. If you avoid leadership, you create stagnation. And stagnation feels like suffering because nothing is more painful than knowing you're capable of more and doing nothing about it. There's a certain energy that comes with taking responsibility, an energy that pulls opportunities toward you, that pulls people toward you, that pulls progress toward you. You rise into a different frequency. You stop thinking like a victim and you begin thinking like a creator. You stop reacting to life and you start shaping it. You stop hiding from challenges and you start seeking them because you understand that every challenge is another way to strengthen who you are. And the greatest part, the moment you stop running from responsibility is the moment life stops running from you. Everything becomes clearer, everything becomes simpler, everything becomes more aligned. Because you're no longer living beneath your potential, you're living up to it. That's why your future expands the moment you stop running from responsibility.